We are in the month of integrity. This is the theme that Centers for Spiritual Living is focusing on this month, in the recognition that we are connected and in service to each other as human beings. And that calls forth from us a certain amount of authenticity and integrity when we're really connecting with each other. And one of the things that's important about that is recognizing that we are all a part of one creation, one infinite life that's expressing through us. So we owe it to each other because we owe it to ourselves. It works both ways. To take our way in the world with integrity and authenticity. So I have a little story about struggle, because today I'm talking about fasting from struggle and feasting on source. That is the source of all that is. Sometimes we get a little bit addicted to our stories and our struggles, and we can get a lot of mileage out of our stories, our traumas, our difficulties. And I don't mean to minimize them, but I think that they can get in the way of our taking a breath in the moment. Anybody out there ever get impatient? Yeah, it's one of my challenges too. So this is a kindergarten teacher who had a challenge. It says Marlon asked his kindergarten teacher to help him get his shoes back on at the end of a very long day. And after quite a struggle with the shoes, which were tight, she finally got them on. They're on the wrong way, Marlon told her. Well, she looked down and realized he was right. Sure enough, the shoes were on the wrong feet. So staying calm, she helped him take them off, switched them to the right feet, and then he said, "These aren't my shoes." So the teacher fought to keep her cool, and she asked Marlon why he hadn't told her that before. She knelt down again and helped him pull his shoes off, and he said, "They aren't my shoes, they're my brother's shoes, my brother's old ones, and Mama told me not to tell anyone." So Marlon's teacher took a deep breath, and she helped him again back into his shoes. And then she finally helped him into his coat and helped him with his scarf, wrapped his scarf around his neck. And then she looked and she said, "Well, Marlon, where are your gloves?" And he said, "Oh," he told her proudly, "I always put those in my shoes so I won't lose them." Okay, again, off with the shoes. You know, there are times when we just hit those moments in life when it seems like one thing after another sort of doesn't quite work for us. It's falling apart or it's giving us trouble. And the tendency is to amp up slowly into that place of frustration or impatience or anger or snippiness that then colors the rest of the way that we feel about what we're experiencing. So I want to talk to you today about, in this period of Lent before Easter, this 40 days that comes before Easter, we're often asked to, or in the Christian tradition, it has been a tradition in the old churches, to do some fasting during this period. And what I'm suggesting is that this is a really good time for us to fast from negative beliefs and behaviors, and to feast on those that deepen us, that bring us closer to God, closer to each other, and allow us to go more deeply into the spiritual truth of who we are. Fra Giovanni, who was a monk in Fiesole, Italy, he was also a painter, he said, "Everything we call a trial or a sorrow or a duty, believe me, that angel's hand is there, and the wonder of an overshadowing presence. Life is so full of meaning and purpose, so full of beauty beneath its covering, that you will find earth but cloaks your heaven." Isn't that beautiful? And J. Sidlow Baxter, who was a pastor and a theologian, said, "What is the difference between an obstacle and an opportunity? Our attitude toward it. Every opportunity has a difficulty, and every difficulty has an opportunity." So I want to talk a little bit about struggle, the experience of struggle. What happens when we're struggling is that we are forgetting that we are infinitely connected in the web of beingness, infinitely connected in so many ways to so many people and resources and circumstances and possibilities. And when we forget that, Our experience is one of separation, that we are disconnected. We feel disconnected from that which could support us. And sometimes we're so married to our particular story about being separate and being an outsider and being alone, that we begin to select people and circumstances and situations in our lives that repeat that pattern that we have claimed. Can you relate to this? And sometimes we don't select things that naturally behave that way, but we project onto them that they are behaving that way, even if they're not, because that's what we're used to seeing. It's the color of the lens we're looking through. Is this making sense so far, what I'm saying? Or we manipulate the situation into doing what we always expected it to do, and then we say, see, I told you. That's how it is for me. That's how life is. So when we get into that kind of situation where we're experiencing a repeated sort of struggle, the difficulty is that we think that is our story. Reverend Carroll once, a number of years ago, on Easter Sunday, was talking about what the theme of Earth is, the life of Earth itself, because this is the time of year that we see this particular phenomena. And she said, suppose each planet had a theme. Then the theme of Earth would be resurrection. Because every spring, now it's fall in the southern hemisphere, so they're letting go, and we are bursting forth into spring. Life is springing up all around us to remind us that the theme of life is that it returns, that it is regenerated, that it is a cycle that doesn't end but moves onward. And when we leave our earthly life, we move onward into a life that we don't see from here, but the cycle continues. So instead of being stuck in that story, we want to move to focusing on the source, the infinite, the root of being, the beginning of everything, the presence of the divine, that infinite consciousness and energy, because it is never distracted, it is never exhausted, it isn't looking away to somewhere else. When we say that God is omnipresent, we mean that. Present everywhere, always. Not limited in time or space, but beyond and in all of time and space, present everywhere. Everywhere. That means where you are too, and where I am. Omnipresent, present everywhere. And so when we remember that we have that deep-rooted source around us and available to us and within us, we begin to recognize that no matter what it looks like in the moment, we can remember that the truth is connection. Oops, let me go back. The truth is connection. Now, when we're feasting on struggle, we tend to be looking at the scary stuff in our lives, the stuff that we don't want to face, the stuff that we're avoiding. Anybody experience that at all? And the struggle arises out of the resistance and the fear that we feel for that experience, whatever it is. So we may come into a sense of victim. I am the victim. So when we hear, it's not fair, that's the place of the victim. And what we're claiming for ourselves when we speak those words is disempowerment. We're saying, I have no choices here. But really, that's never true. We always have some kind of choice. So that victim identity weakens us because it convinces us that we do not have another choice. Also, feasting on struggle sometimes leads us to wanting someone else to blame for circumstances that surround us. So we'll often hear, it's not my fault. Anybody relate to that one at all? It's not my fault. I didn't do this. And yet, there you are. So sometimes when we find ourselves in a circumstance, it's important for us to recognize that the common denominator in all of our experiences is that we are there. And if we're there, my theory about it is that if we're present with something that's difficult, we're either there because we have something essential that needs to be brought. We're being called to that, to bring something beneficial to it, or we're in it in order to grow, to learn something, to expand our choices, our awareness, our consciousness, to make a new choice. So the struggle itself can be there to serve us. It's kind of like the struggle of the butterfly to get out of that chrysalis once it has transformed. So when the transformation is happening, and I like to come back to this story again and again, of the caterpillar that goes into this state of transformation. Now, I don't know if you know it or not, but a caterpillar and a butterfly are two completely different genomes. Isn't that interesting? So what happens when the caterpillar is overwhelmed with this urge to begin to eat, and it eats and it eats and it eats and it eats, and then it hangs on the branch in a J shape, and it becomes solid. It gets hard. The outside sometimes becomes clear, so you can even see what's happening inside. And what happens inside is that the imaginal cells, and that's actually what they're called, the imaginal cells of the butterfly begin to multiply. And the caterpillar's body sees those as foreign and tries to fight them off. So it resists. It resists the transformation. But the cells, the imaginal cells of the butterfly, proliferate anyway. And finally, they overcome the caterpillar. And in this process, the caterpillar completely liquefies in the chrysalis. So at that point, it's either go forward or you're jello. Those are your choices, you know. There's no going back, you know. No caterpillar finally succeeds in overcoming the new genome. It doesn't happen. So that liquid, that soup that's in there, begins to form this completely new creature, this butterfly. And when it gets so full in there, feeding on this soup of the caterpillar, when it fully forms itself as a butterfly, at a certain point, it takes a breath. And when it takes a breath, the chrysalis pops. It cracks open. Now, that's the point at which we feel we want to be able to help the butterfly because it struggles. It struggles mightily. But its struggle is not without fruitfulness. It's not without purpose. It's not without gain. That struggle has meaning. And as the butterfly struggles, what happens is it finally becomes strong enough to get out of the chrysalis. Now, in the process of that struggle, the body, which is full of liquid, begins to pump. And it pumps this liquid out of the body into the wings, which open and dry in the sun so this creature can fly. Imagine being something that crawled on the ground all your life and suddenly being able to fly. But then, of course, it isn't really the same creature anymore. It has been transformed. That is something we can take into our understanding of struggle. That there is meaning, and the struggle itself is a birth process that is part of the design to make us stronger. It isn't without meaning. So when I'm talking about fasting from struggle, I'm talking about fasting from it as wasteful, as meaningless, as being punished, as difficulty, rather than as the infinite divine presence reaching out and saying, keep coming this way. There's more you have to become. Come as I'm leading you. Follow me. Come this way. Don't give up the struggle that makes you stronger, but enter into it with purpose. Bless you. So that instead of being resistant to help, and you know, when somebody's resistant to help, what you'll often hear is something like, well, you just don't understand. I was sharing with my foundations class this week, and maybe I shared it with you last week too. You know, if you've heard this, bear with me. There was a woman in my foundations class many years ago whose daughter had been murdered. And she was in the deepest grief and anger toward this man who was in prison in San Quentin on death row. And she was in such pain and anguish. Her daughter wasn't even the target. It was her daughter's boyfriend, but because she was there with him, they were both killed. And one of the things that kept coming to her unwillingly and unwanted in the midst of the struggle was the invitation to forgive. That forgiveness would somehow help to free her. But she couldn't do it. She was in such suffering, she was in such agony and such anger and such rage and such loss. Can you imagine? But she was taking a Course in Miracles class. She was coming to our church. She was taking the class, and everywhere she went, she kept hearing about this. And finally, she decided she could do this much. She would write him a letter, and she would tell him, I forgive you. I'm not forgiving you because you deserve it or because you've earned it, but because I am learning to grow spiritually, and I understand that if I'm ever going to be free from the horrors of what happened to my daughter, that I need to be able to forgive you. So I don't want you to expect that I'm going to come and advocate for you in prison. I don't want you to expect that I'm going to do anything to visit you, but I will pray for you, and I do forgive you. And he got a letter back from her saying, you don't know what your letter has meant to me or how long I have prayed for this. He said, I do not expect you to visit me. I do not expect you to advocate for me. You have done more than enough. Something happened to her. She went to visit him. She began to visit him regularly in San Quentin and to find out more about who he was and what had happened and how he wound up in that situation that day that took her daughter's life. And she began to advocate against the death penalty. And she began to get to know other people in the prison, other prisoners, other visitors. She works now with the families of murder victims, not to get them to forgive. And I remember her telling the story, but to deal with the grief that they're feeling and to share it with one another and to grieve together and to heal together. And I remember her saying that there was a woman at one of these gatherings whose adult child had been murdered. And she said to her, well, obviously, if you can forgive the man who murdered your daughter, you must not love her as much as I loved my child. And somebody said to Gail later, oh, what a horrible thing for somebody to say to you. And she said, you know, I was exactly where she is. So I do not take that personally. I hold nothing against her. I know what she's experiencing, and I know how painful that is. Something happened that set her free. Her daughter is still gone. There is still a loss there. There is still grief there. That never goes away. But the terrible struggle with the resistance to be helped, with the resistance to let go and forgive, that part of it, bless you, that part of it is over. She stepped into source. Do you see what I'm meaning here? Is this making sense, what I'm saying to you? Howard Thurman, who was an African-American minister in San Francisco, said in his book, The Inward Journey, when have you last had a good session with yourself? Or have you ever had it out with you? Most often you're brought face to face with yourself only when such an encounter is forced upon you. Usually it's in connection with a crisis situation. Whatever may be the occasion, there comes a deep necessity which leads you finally into the closet with yourself. It is here that you raise the real questions about yourself. The leading one is, what is it after all that I amount to, ultimately? Such a question cuts through all that is superficial and trivial in life to the very nerve center of yourself. Now, I want to tell you something about being caught, about being in a struggle. because it can feel like being stuck in quicksand. And you know, in quicksand, if you struggle, you will sink. The density of an average human body is about 62 pounds per cubic foot, which is less than quicksand's 125 pounds per cubic foot. So the advice is stay calm, and eventually you'll float. Stretch out on your back to increase your surface area and wait until your legs pop free. And then they suggest moving your legs around at this point to stir water in, which will help you to float. This fellow says you have to introduce water into the sand, and the easiest way to do that is to make it trickle along your leg into the quicksand by making a circular motion with your leg. So the advice is the same in times of personal struggle and pain, I think. Stay calm. Relax into the arms of God, and eventually you'll float. I want to share with you a little bit about this man. This is Viktor Frankl. When he was a young man, he was a psychiatrist in Germany. His parents, his siblings, he and his wife were taken to Auschwitz. They were Jews. They were taken to Auschwitz. And what gave him meaning and kept him alive through it was the burning desire that he would see his pregnant wife again. She did not survive, nor did anyone in his family. And yet, he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Everything he was and everything he had any control over was taken from him except one thing: the power to choose how he would respond internally to the torture and the deprivation and what was happening to him, whether or not he would become bitter and hopeless and disempowered. And he talks about our search for meaning, making meaning out of our experiences. We become hopeless when we feel there is no meaning to our experiences. And we can often become hopeless if we can't see possibilities. Now, here's a man who, to all intents and purposes, you can't imagine how he could see any possibilities. And yet, he found them. Norm Howe, and I don't know who Norm Howe is, maybe a comedian, he said, when I'm in a good space, I see obstructions as instruction. When I'm in a bad space, even instructions look like obstructions. And so here we have the power of interpretation, the power of choice, the power of how are we going to look at this? How are we going to look at this moment? Is there a way that we can embrace, or at least allow and flow with the moment that's being presented to us, deciding what meaning we're going to make of an experience we have? When J.K. Rowling was writing the first Harry Potter book, it was rejected by, do you know how many publishers? Oh, well, I have 12 here. It might have been more than that. It was a lot. It was a lot. And when she was writing the original book, her life was, as she says, a mess. She was going through a divorce. She was living in a tiny little flat with her little baby daughter. She was surviving on government subsidies, and her mother had just died of multiple sclerosis. And then her book was rejected 12 times or 27 times. And she turned the negatives into a positive for herself ultimately by spending most of her free time working on the Harry Potter series. She also drew from her bad experiences to contribute to her writing. Any of you in here Harry Potter fans besides me? A few of you, okay. So you recognize there are some bad guys in Harry Potter, and then some bad things happen in those stories as well. But there are also some good guys. And we see the main character growing through his own frustrations and struggles and impatience to a place where he stands in the midst of sort of, the firestorm, as it were, and goes forward, not knowing what will come next, what the meaning will be, or what will happen to him. So when we go to accept that there is meaning, then we are taking away the juice from the struggle that we have given to it, or that it has multiplied in. We are taking it back into shifting our attention to source. And the meaning of feasting on the source, the infinite, the loving hand of God, that meaning guides our responses. It guides our responses to our successes and to our difficulties, to both of those things as they show up in our lives. There are times in our lives where everybody's telling us how great we are, how wonderful we're doing, whatever it is. We can get lost in those press clippings a little too enthusiastically. And then there are times when things aren't going so well, and we can react just as strongly to any negative feedback that's given to us at the time, taking both of those too seriously, rather than coming back to the truth of who we are. Jesus said, "You are the light of the world." But a light that's put under a bushel basket doesn't do anybody any good. You are the salt of the earth, but if you lose the zest of who you are, then you can't season anything with your presence. Rather, take your light, put it up on the lampstand. Let your light be seen, let it be given, let it be felt, and trust that it is enough for where you are. That's what I'm saying. Because if you are sent, the light that you are is sufficient for the moment. Whether you know it or not, whether you see the results of it or not, in that moment, if you are there, there's a meaning for your being there. Then bring your light there. Does this make sense? Yes? Yes? I want to finally share with you this story. Whoops. This woman, This woman is Immaculée Ilibagiza. She is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. Everyone in her family was killed, and they were killed with machetes, and they were killed by their neighbors, people who were their friends, because they were from two different tribes. And the mob mentality that took over like a wave of slaughter and genocide. And during this time, she was hiding in a bathroom in a pastor's house who was of the other tribe, hidden even from his family, in this little bathroom that they didn't use, that was in a funny little part of the house. And it was behind a bookcase, kind of like with Anne Frank, and it was hidden. And he would bring them food once a day. And there were women crammed into this little bathroom. They couldn't all sit down at the same time. So most of them stood. Sometimes they would take turns being able to squat. And they got one meal a day. They had nowhere to wash. They had no clothes to change. And they were there for months. When she went in to that bathroom, she weighed 115 pounds. When she came out, she weighed 65 pounds. This is after, I'm going to share this bit of her story with you. This is after she was released, when the French came with the UN, and finally it became safe, and the people who were doing all this murdering began to be arrested. She was released. And she says this: "I knew that my family was at peace, but that didn't ease the pain of missing them. And I couldn't shake the crippling sorrow that seized my heart whenever I envisioned how they had been killed. Every night I prayed to be released from my private agony, from the nightmares that haunted my sleep and troubled my days. It took a while. But as always, God answered my prayers. This time he did so by sending me a dream, unlike any I've ever had. I was in a helicopter flying over my family's house, but I was trapped in a dark cloud. I could see Mom, Dad, Damascene, and Vianney high above me, standing in the sky and bathed in a warm white light that radiated tranquility. The light intensified and spread across the sky until it engulfed the dark cloud hiding me, and suddenly I was with my family again. The dream was so real that I reached out and felt the warmth of their skin, the gentleness of their touch. I was so happy that I danced in the air. Damascene was wearing a crisp white shirt and blue trousers. He looked at me with a joyful glow and gave me his brilliant smile. My mother, father, and Vianney stood behind him, holding hands and beaming at me. "Hey, Immaculée, it's good to see that we can still make you happy," my beautiful brother said. "You've been gloomy far too long and must stop all this crying. Look at the wonderful place we're in. Can you see how happy we are? If you continue to believe that we're suffering, you'll force us to return to the pain we've left behind. I know how much you miss us, but do you really want us to come back and suffer?" "No, no, Damascene," I cried out as tears of joy poured from my eyes. "Don't come back here. Wait for me there, and I will come join you all. When God is done with me in this life, I will come to you." "We'll be here waiting, dear sister. Now heal your heart. You must love and you must forgive those who have trespassed against us." My family slowly receded into the sky until it disappeared into the heavens. I was still hovering over my house, but I was no longer in a dark cloud and no longer in a helicopter. I was flying like a bird above my village, above the pastor's house and the French camp, above all the forests and rivers and waterfalls of my beautiful country. I was soaring above Rwanda. I felt so liberated from grief and gravity that I began to sing for joy. I sang from my heart, the words tumbling happily from my mouth. "Thank you, God, for love that is beyond our understanding." My singing woke the entire house. And since it was the middle of the night, Sarah's mom came running into my room worried that I'd fallen ill and was delirious with a fever. From that night onward, my tears began to dry, and my pain eased. I never again agonized over the fate of my family. I accepted that I would always mourn and miss them, but I'd never spend another moment worrying about the misery they'd endured. By sending me that dream, God had shown me that my family was in a place beyond suffering. He'd also shown me that I had to make another trip to my village. I watched as I arrived at the prison late in the afternoon and was greeted by Semana, the new burgomaster of Kibuye. Semana had been a teacher before the genocide, as well as a colleague and good friend of my dad's. He was like an uncle to me. 4 of his 6 children had been killed in the slaughter, and I told him he must have faith that his little ones were with God. "I can see how much the world has changed. The children now comfort the parents," he replied sadly. As burgomaster, Semana was a powerful politician in charge of arresting and detaining the killers who had terrorized our area. He'd interrogated hundreds of Interahamwe and knew better than anyone which killers had murdered whom. And he knew why I'd come to see him. "Do you want to meet the leader of the gang that killed your mother and Damascene?" "Yes, sir, I do." I watched through the window as he crossed a courtyard to the prison cell and then returned, shoving a disheveled, limping old man in front of him. I jumped up with a start as they approached, recognizing the man instantly. His name was Felicien, and he was a successful Hutu businessman whose children I'd played with in primary school. He had been a tall, handsome man who always wore expensive suits and had impeccable manners. I shivered, remembering that it had been his voice I'd heard calling out my name when the killers searched for me at the pastor's. Felicien had haunted me. He had hunted me. Semana pushed Felicien into the office, and he stumbled onto his knees. When he looked up from the floor and saw that I was the one who was waiting for him, the color drained from his face. He quickly shifted his gaze and stared at the floor. "Stand up, killer," Semana shouted. "Stand up and explain to this girl why her family is dead. Explain to her why you murdered her mother and butchered her brother. Get up," I said. "Get up and tell her." Semana screamed even louder, but the battered man remained hunched and kneeling, too embarrassed to stand and face me. His dirty clothing hung from his emaciated frame in tatters. His skin was sallow, bruised, and broken, and his eyes were filmed and crusted. His once handsome face was hidden behind a filthy matted beard, and his bare feet were covered in open running sores. I wept at the sight of his suffering. Felicien had let the devil enter his heart, and the evil had ruined his life like a cancer in his soul. He was now the victim of his victims, destined to live in torment and regret. I was overwhelmed with pity for the man. He looted your parents' home and robbed your family's plantation, Immaculée. We found your dad's farm machinery at his house, didn't we? Simona yelled at Felicien. After he killed Rose and Damascene, he kept looking for you. He wanted you dead so he could take over your property, didn't you, pig? I flinched, letting out an involuntary gasp. Simona looked at me, stunned by my reaction and confused by the tears streaming down my face. He grabbed Felicien by the shirt collar and hauled him to his feet. What do you have to say to her? What do you have to say to Immaculée? Felicien was sobbing. I could feel his shame. He looked up at me for only a moment, but our eyes met. I reached out and touched his hands lightly and quietly, and said what I had come to say. I forgive you. My heart eased immediately, and I saw the tension release in Felicien's shoulders before Simona pushed him out the door and into the courtyard. 2 soldiers yanked Felicien up by his armpits and dragged him back toward his cell. When Simona returned, he was furious. What was that all about, Immaculée? That was the man who murdered your family. I brought him to you to question, to spit on if you wanted to. But you forgave him? How could you do that? Why did you forgive him? And I answered him with the truth. Forgiveness is all I have to offer. Forgiveness is all I have to offer. The struggles that we go through, the people that we hold things against or we judge, the challenges that we face are so much smaller than what she went through or what Viktor Frankl went through. And surely if these people could choose, as Jesus did on the cross, to forgive, surely we too have the possibility and the opportunity to step beyond the struggle into the source and to offer forgiveness, not only to others, but also to ourselves for the places where we've held on for too long and caused ourselves too much suffering. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, says in A New Design for Living, we must not lose sight of the fact that what we are talking about has nothing to do with willpower. We are not forcing anything to happen. We do not coerce God. We cooperate. As we recognize God's universal nature as good, as the source of all abundance, as the perfection that resides behind all life, then we may come to accept all these things. We do not create them of ourselves. We accept them, and in our acceptance of them, they are manifested in and as our experience. We make space for the struggle, we make space for the resistance, and we open to the opportunity that's being revealed. What am I being called to here? We open to that, and we step forward into that. And that is when we are set free. So I want to finish with this blessing from the Irish priest John O'Donoghue. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the gray window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colors, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays in the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, may there come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours. May the clarity of the light be yours. May the fluency of the ocean be yours. May the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life. Namaste. Thank you. Now, this is our time of prayer, so I'm going to invite our practitioners to surround the room. These dear ones are our licensed practitioners. They are licensed by Centers for Spiritual Living as prayer practitioners and spiritual counselors. They are available every Sunday following the service to sit with you in prayer. The people who are up here at the practitioner table are the ones who are available on this particular Sunday, and all of them surrounding you, many of them wearing their white practitioner stoles, are here to join with me in prayer for all of us, that our struggles have meaning, that we open to the meaning, that we step into the source, and that we allow our hearts to open wider to forgiveness. So we begin. In this moment, I turn within, and I lift my heart and mind to that infinite presence of love, which is the creator and the source of all that is. I know that that presence is one of infinite love and wisdom, infinite peace and grace, that it flows through me and every person in this room, that it blesses and uplifts and reveals the truth of wholeness and life to every single one in the ways they best can hear it, receive it, allow it, and be blessed by it. I'm deeply grateful to know that struggles are temporary, but source is permanent. That life is good always, even when it doesn't look that way. And so for all of our loved ones, I know peace, freedom from struggle, entry into forgiveness, and source with love and grace. I let this word go knowing that it's taken by the creative law of mind and spirit and acted upon now to bring it into form and being and experience. So I release it with love and gratitude and let it be. And so it is. And so it is.